Okay, so welcome everybody. Good evening or the late afternoon. As you all know, this is the continuation of our Scientiae online seminar called History of Scholarship and the Global Imagination. Uh, uh, Stefano, Gulizia, and myself, we are organizing this online seminar. Stefano is hosting 1 week from Turin, the other week I'm hosting from Prague. And the seminar is also supported by the Institute of Philosophy, Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. Our today's speaker is Gábor Petneházi. Gábor is currently working at the Institute for Classical Philology and Neo-Latin Studies at the University of Innsbruck. He studied history, classical and Neo-Latin philology at the University of Szeged, where he obtained his PhD. And he is now a postdoctoral researcher at the project The Dissertations of the Academia Taxiana. And we will also hear about Academia Taxiana today. Gábor's main research interests include early modern historiography, humanism and the Republic of Letters, early modern politics and intellectual history, and early modern manuscripts and print culture. He published more than 40 articles and studies on these topics and a number of translations from Latin into Hungarian, including Erasmus of Rotterdam, Paolo Giovio, Jean-Michel Bruto, and other mainly humanist authors from the 16th century. And I should mention one more thing, which is quite important. In 2020 in Trento, Gábor, with his colleague Peter Kassa, discovered one of the most important historiographical manuscripts of the 16th century, Jean-Michel Bruto's Rerum Ungaricarum Libri, which was previously thought to be lost. And if I'm not mistaken, both Gábor and Peter are working on the analysis of this manuscript, on the text tradition and literary analysis of this extensive and very important work. Okay, welcome, Gábor. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this really nice introduction, and thank you for being here and to be able to present in this circle this topic, what I have already presented in the Scientiae Brussels. And yeah, my apologies to all of those who were attending, because I just slightly modified, of course, that paper. So yeah, but anyway, I think it's worth to, repetition, repetitio mater studiorum. So, and any comments and questions, of course, are warmly welcome. So I try to share my presentation. You can see probably. Okay. So, Dark Side of Catholic Enlightenment, Reinventing and Rationalizing Blood Libel at the Academia Taxiana is the title. Well, which needs some explanation, first of all. In fact, this title is a bit misleading. It sounds attractive probably, but rather obscures than illuminates the subject. Beginning with the term Enlightenment. The Academia Taxiana, although it was indeed an association of Catholic intellectuals between 1741 and 1756, well, it can be called enlightened with a very little credit. This is also in line with the periodization generally accepted in the literature, which places the first appearance of the Enlightenment in Austria at the beginning of Josephinism. So somewhere in the second half of the reign of Maria Theresa. And accordingly, the dark side does not cover the truth either. The phenomenon discussed here, the cult of saints based on anti-Semitic blood label accusations, which was not only accepted but also propagated by significant groups of Catholic intellectuals, well, it was by no means an exceptional phenomenon in the Catholic Church of the century of Enlightenment. It seems that at least within the confessional boundaries, it was rather a generally accepted cultural heritage, the affirmation of which has been successfully achieved in Austria in the middle of the century, almost on the doorstep of Enlightenment absolutism. An important role in this success, because it was a success undoubtedly, was played by Catholic intellectuals, members of the Academia Taxiana in Innsbruck, who actively contributed to the reaffirmation of the cult of San Simonino in Trento and Andreas von Rijn in North Tyrol, two children allegedly murdered by Jews in the second half of the 15th century. Their cult was so strengthened that just after the Second Lateran Council, decades after the Holocaust, has been abolished officially by the Catholic authorities. Today, most of the material relics of these cults, the public and highly naturalistic images, just going back, it was also disposed in the Judestein Church. This was the group of statue depicting the scene of the blood label murdering. So this, sorry, I'm lost. So the naturalistic images, frescoes, statues, inscription now have disappeared. They have been painted over, replaced, or repaired. And although there is a relatively considerable amount of literature on the development of the blood label accusation in Tyrol and Trentino, very little is known about the process of the official canonization of Andreas von Rijn in the 18th century, and about the intellectual efforts and the contribution of the local intellectual elite in this process. The only exception is a monograph written by Nicola Cusomano, which shows through the correspondence between Girolamo Tartarotti of Rovereto and Benedetto Bonelli of Trento, that in the southern side of the Alps, although the two eminent scholars disagreed on the question of witchcraft and black magic, they uncritically accepted the anti-Judaic blood label, which apparently was an unquestionable common ground, common Catholic ground, both for them. So here we come to the northern side of the Brennero. I will present the cult of Andreas von Rijn, who was officially beatified by the church in 1755. And I will also show the role played by the members of the Academia Taxiana in this successful project. Apparently, these men truly believed that they had to reinforce the local Catholicism on this, so based on this narrative, this blood label narrative, although the idea was already under attack from many sides at the time. First, about the Taxiana. The Taxiana, Academia Taxiana, was a scholarly society that never attained the status of a formal academy and existed in Innsbruck from 1741 to 1756. Its members came both from the local intellectuals and the ecclesiastical and political elite of the province. The academy's declared aim was, unlike in the case of other Enlightenment or early Enlightenment academies, to study exclusively the history in a general sense, but with a strong local interest. The minutes or protocols of the weekly discussions and reading sessions held on Fridays have been preserved in their entirety, while the so-called dissertations, which were in circulation, have survived only in part. These dissertations, so manuscript dissertations, are short treatises, essays, on average about 50 pages long, written in Latin. From the literary historian aspect, the texts belong to an intermediate genre between a real university thesis and a lecture. and probably we can use a contemporary Italian term, and so they can also be called discorso academico. The aim of our project is to collect these dissertations and publish them in a transcripts-based database. Two of the dissertations have been written on the subject of blood labels, namely on the history of two children, Tyrolean children, allegedly murdered ritually by Jews. The first is Andreas von Rijn and the other Ursula von Lienz, whose cult was sought to be revived in the 18th century, in the case of Andreas with success. Both for the legend of Ursula and Andreas, the starting point is the most famous blood label accusation in the wider region, the story of Simonino da Trento, a 3-year-old boy who disappeared in Trento on Holy Thursday in 1475. His body was found on Easter Sunday near the only Jewish-occupied residential quarter in the city. The death of the child, who was said to be covered with many wounds, generated an immediate devotional cult. Crowds of pilgrims flocked to the never-buried decaying body, put on public display in the church of San Pietro Paolo. A couple of months later, when the local Jews accused of murder had been already cruelly executed, the legend of the Holy Martyr was also ready. This legend was built up from elements regularly repeated since the first legend of William of Norwich. I think it's quite known. And according to the legend of Simonino, the Jews had indulged both their hostility to Christians and their need for Christian blood, supposedly used for ritual and medicinal purposes. Therefore, they tortured to death the small Simonino. The spirit of blood label, however, did not remain within the walls of Trento, as Simonino's case suddenly gave rise to new cases of infanticide allegedly committed by Jews across the region. Anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism swept through Trentino and the Tyrol at the end of the 15th century, despite the fact that Sixtus IV had forbidden the veneration of Simonino. And the local cult did not receive official papal approval until the end of the 16th century, until 1588. The large number of recorded cases meant not only new blood accusations, but also reopening of older incidents, and in the case of certain earlier infanticides, framing them by previously unimagined anti-Semitic blood accusations. In the following, I will only deal with Ursula von Lienz and Andreas von Rijn, already mentioned. So the big picture you can see in the group of statue, which depicts the murdering of Simonino, then Ursula on the upper corner, and well, it still can be seen in the small village of Tulfes. This is two pictures about Andreas and Ursula in a house, you can see, in a private house. So, Ursula Lienz and Andreas von Rijn. Ursula, the daughter of Thomas Puck, a citizen of Lienz, was murdered or was the victim of an accident in 1442 or 43. The date is uncertain because the first surviving testimonies about the incident were not recorded until the case of Simonino, until the year 1475, by which time there were few living witnesses. Like in the case of Simonino, the discovery of the body was followed by a mob, which pinpointed the guilty parties in the local Jews and the Christian woman who was accused of having seduced the little girl and handed her over to the Jews, who allegedly were eager to make a ritual sacrifice. The swift condemnation was followed by brutal executions. The accused Jewish men were killed and impaled, but the women of the family were also burnt alive, and only the children were spared, being placed in a Christian family. The Jewish community of the city was basically exterminated. So this is East Tyrol. However, the religious aspect seems to have played a minor role in Lienz. The main accusation against the Jews was also the ritual use of blood, but no cult of sanctity developed around Ursula. The revival of the Simonino cult in Trento was only enough to bring the case to the foreground, but here was no sequel. So when Anton Roschmann, a leading figure of the Academia Taxiana, was commissioned in the 18th century, in 1739, to oversee the examination of the child's bones as notarius apostolicus, so Ursula's bones, he could only collect the minutes of these hearings from 1475, as well as the manuscript and printed historiographical works using and citing these testimonies. So no real cult of Saint Ursula was established in the end, but the liquidation of Jewish community remained part of the local memory. The situation was quite different in the case of a little boy allegedly murdered at the age of 3 by Jewish traveling merchants near to the village of Rhin. The small village 10 kilometers east of Innsbruck never had a Jewish community, and the legend of the blood label was invented very late in 1620 by Ippolito Guarinoni, the physician of the monastery in Hall in Tyrol. The term fiction is to be taken literally, almost literally. Before the 17th century, there existed no written source that could have supported a single element of the story, which Guarinoni had created in great detail, and which in the 19th century was even included in the collection of the brothers Grimm. This means that even the most basic elements of the story are completely fictional. Guarinoni seems to have suggested the name of the victim and his father. Simon Oxner was the father and Andreas the child, which rhymes perfectly with Simonino of Trento, whose father was named Andrea. Guarinoni has also calculated the month and the day of the murder on the basis of the approximate time of the Nuremberg merchants, the murderer's return from the Bolzano fair, and the coincidence with the harvest for which the boy's mother left home on the day of the murder. This is how the 12th of July became the date of Andreas's murder, for which Guarinoni, by his own account and with quite Baroque mysticism, found out the year of 1462 in a dream vision. Despite all these factual contradictions, from the second half of the 17th century, in accordance with Guarinoni's last wishes, a church was built on the alleged crime scene, the so-called Judenstein, which is now part of the village, where the remains were transferred from the church cemetery of Rhin in 1671. It is also not known how these bones were identified and where they were kept before Guarinoni's time. In the absence of sources, it is difficult to determine to what extent this legend was part of a living oral tradition in Guarinoni's time, and to what extent it was merely the product of the vivid imagination of the doctor, who had other merits as well in Baroque Catholicism. Just one typical example for his rich imagination and how personal the blood label was to him. When Guarinoni examined Simonino's skeleton in Trento, he recorded more than 5,800 scars on the bones, which allegedly was inflicted by the Jews. But let us now turn to the 18th century. How did develop the religious practice originated from the blood label, and what role played the members of the Taxiana achieving finally the beatification of Andreas? As I mentioned, the members of the Academy were partly local intellectuals and partly from the political elite and aristocracy. Anton Roschmann, the initiator of the society, also held the honorary title of Historicus Provinciae of Tyrol from 1740. By 1746, he succeeded in establishing the university library as a regional public library, of which he was also the first director. He worked with great diligence and patriotism on the history of Tyrol, making extensive use of the manuscript sources and documents in the Castle of Ambras and in the various family and ecclesiastical archives. Nevertheless, most of his works remained in manuscript, and his great comprehensive history of the Tyrol was never completed. This puts in a slightly new light what Roschmann's personal ambition was for the Academia Taxiana, founded to study exclusively the science of history. He had bad relations with the Jesuits, the local Jesuits who ran the university, but he also lacked the qualifications to teach at the university because he had only a lower degree in law. He was licentiatus. His literacy and expertise in paleography, however, was recognized by the local elite, and his services were called upon for family history researches or even the ecclesiastical history. These studies resulted in works which, to a large extent, also enriched the manuscript collection of the Academia Taxiana. However, Roschmann did not want to keep his knowledge to himself. Among his plans was an extra university institution that would train professional historians, teaching them the skills of the archivist and manuscript specialist. This can be deduced from a recently discovered letter in the Vienna archives, dated around 1748, which Roschmann addressed to Baron Bartenstein, Maria Theresa's advisor. According to Roschmann's own statement, his main strength was the res diplomatica, so he was excellent at reading and classifying manuscripts of different ages, and he wanted simply to share this knowledge. To do this, however, he first had to convince the local elite of his expertise, and he was successful doing this. As mentioned above, the examination of Ursula's bones, or what was believed to be them, was carried out in 1739 at the request of the monastery of Hall in Tyrol. Roschmann was involved as notarius apostolicus, and shortly afterwards, presumably already at the time of the beginnings of the Academia Taxiana, he compiled a collection of documents of several hundred pages, in which he not just collected manuscript sources about Ursula, but also all the surviving data on all the participants of the famous interrogation in the city of Lienz in 1475. He also found an early, previously unknown manuscript text of the legend itself, which became the only published item from this collection. Namely, the short text was included in the monumental Dissertazione Apologetica of Benedetto Bonelli, a Franciscan friar from Trento. The work was published in 1747. Bonelli's aim, as the title suggests, was to respond to the growing number of writings published in the meantime, denouncing the absurdity and untenability of the blood label. In chapter 5, he brings together the cases of blood label rediscovered after the Trento case, and here we find the mention of Roschmann's work and the full text of the legend in the notes. Now, Trento and Innsbruck are not far apart, but Bonelli and Roschmann knew each other personally as well. According to the minutes of the Taxiana, Bonelli attended a meeting of the Academia in person on the 12th of December, 1744, and spoke there about Simonino. At the end of the evening, he was admitted to the members of the Taxiana by the unanimous vote of the membership being present. According also the protocols, half year earlier, on the 9th of May of the same year, another member of the Academy, Adrian Kempter, a teacher at the Premonstrean monastery of Wilten near Innsbruck, gave a lecture on Andreas Rhin. Kempter's dissertation has not survived, but presumably Roschmann wrote his short manuscript dissertation entitled De probanda identitate sacri corporis divi Andreae Rinnensis as a prequel to Kempter's work in 1743, as the date can be deduced from the text. A draft copy, currently in the library of the Ferdinandeum in Innsbruck, was previously known. A clarified and finalized version was found in the monastery archives of the Wilten Monastery in December last year. Here you can see at least the title page, the Probanda Identitate, that was found in the Wilten Monastery. I'm back to work. So, Roschmann's approach to the subject is apparently critical. It is like reading a desiderata list of what sources to find and where to look for them. For example, in the landowner's family archives or the archives of the Archbishop of Brixen. But the sources are due to be collected not about the murder itself, but about what happened with the body between 1475 and 1620. So it's a peculiar contradiction that after stating that there are in fact no written sources before Guarinoni, either on what actually happened or on the various places where the body was kept, Rochman finally concludes by saying that since Guarinoni recorded these things, we must believe him. Although all other authors are silent, the authority of the erudite and almost Saint Guarinoni cannot be criticized. Why was Andreas' case taken up in 1743-44? In May 1743, at the initiative of the Abbot of Wilton, the bones of the child previously kept in a wooden chest were officially examined. In July, a solemn procession was held. Andreas' skeleton, dressed in white and placed in an ornate glass reliquary, was carried from the Church of Judenstein eastwards to Schwarz and back to Innsbruck. The cult was revitalized. People flocked to see the local saint, miraculous healings took place, etc. It was all part of a campaign to have the cult approved by the Pope and to have Andreas officially declared a martyr of the church. The initiator was the Abbey of Wilton. The correspondence of the entire process and even invoices from local craftsmen for the Judenstein church renovation still can be found in the Wilton archives. Part of the same campaign was a work in Latin published by Kempter in 1745 of more than 300 pages entitled Acta Pro Veritate Martyrii Sancti Andreae Rinnensis. In this work, which is divided into 12 chapters, Kempter provides an inventory of the sources and then analyzes them along the various key moments of the legend, from Andreas's origin to the miraculous events that followed his death. Without going into further detail here, I want only to highlight one characteristic element, namely the way in which he responds to the question of lacking sources raised by Rochman. As he writes, it is inherently very difficult, almost impossible to collect all the documents. Ardum nimis intolerabile. Onus, especially since hardly anything from the 15th century has survived. As for the Sonnenburg family archives, which Rossmann mentioned by name in his dissertation, he says he tried and asked, but the material was so disorganized and the documents were in such a bad state that it would have been an impossible task, especially during the winter. Great save. And this also justifies Rochman's point made in his memorandum to Bartenstein 4 years later about how much good archivists well instructed for the use of manuscripts of different ages would have been needed for any historical research. Kempter's Acta was published in July 1745, and in fact, he really started to work during the previous winter on it. This is documented by his letters to Girolamo Tartarotti, a distinguished church historian in Rovereto, and founding member of the famous Accademia dei Agiati. Here we come to the international contacts and the active exchange of information between the various members of the Catholic academic network, which backs the revival of the cult of Andreas. So Kempter wrote his first letter to Tartarotti in November 1744 without knowing each other, but referring to a mutual acquaintance, Franz Ferdinand Giuliani, a military physician in Innsbruck, who was born in Rovereto and was also a member of the Taxiana. In this letter, Kempter wonders if Tartarotti has any manuscript from Guarinoni or from another previous author to whom Guarinoni refers, because he needs them for his work of Andreas Rinn, but he has only 3 months to complete the manuscript, as he writes. Tartarotti, to his polite reply, enclosed a note on Guarinoni found among his manuscripts, and Kempter included this text in his published Acta as well. But he also added a warning. Concerning the children murdered by the Jews, you can see the Latin text for that puerus attinat Hebreis of Kizos, the number of whom is very great in Italy and Germany. There are some who think that this is a mere fabrication and slander against the unfortunate nation by the princes, in order to take their money from them on this pretext. If I remember correctly, Johannes Wagenseil published a treatise on this in German, in which he sought to absolve the Jews. Don't ask me what arguments he relied on, because I haven't read that work at all. However, it's a bizarre claim by a stranger to our community that deserves to be refuted. You can do that most conveniently in the preface. We will return to Johann Christoph Wagenseil, but it is worth noting both Tartarotti's cautious distance, but also his firmly held Catholic position. There is a contrary argument. He has not read it, but it's a paradoxum and a statement of an alien, which is necessary, or a stranger, which is necessary to be responded. Kempter's next survived letter to Tartarotti was sent at the end of July 1745. The book has been published. He sends gift copies. Then he writes, I confess that better would be the vital spirit of the age have permitted the book if, in obedience to your warning, I had expelled at the beginning of the book the flies of Wagenseil, Misson, Basnage, and Simonius, which annoy us with their infamous accusations. I was ready for the fight, but I met Benedetto Bonelli and learned that he was going to hunt down these flies with great preparation. Then I respectfully abandoned my intention in order not to give the reader an empty shadow instead of the trophy, and not to appear to have taken the glory from others. So the Catholic camp seemed to be united. Kempter indeed accepted Tartarotti's advice. He consulted the German work. Actually, he quotes it almost in Tartarotti's words, not in the preface, but at the end of his work. By this time, in December 1744, he had also met Benedetto Bonelli, who was preparing to write his Apologia of San Simonino with great preparation, gathering all the possible sources and including all the parallel cases to refute once and for all the sacrilegious opinions that proclaimed the absurdity of blood label and were defending the faithless people, so the Jews. The work was finally published in, Bonelli's work, 1747, 2 years after Kempter's work, in truly overwhelming volume and detail, and of course in a totally anti-Enlightenment spirit, fiercely defending the cult of the saints and the Catholic tradition. But who was these against whom the Holy Cult had to be defended? Who were the counterparts? Just briefly. Two of the authors are worth highlighting here. Johann Christoph Wagenseil was the most famous Hebraist of the early modern period and one of the first and best known advocates of Judeo-Christian dialogue and tolerance in the Holy Roman Empire. He wrote several works refuting the accusations against the Jews, and one in particular on the absurdity of the blood labels and the use of Christian blood for any purpose. Der denen Juden fälschlich beigemessene Gebrauch des Christenbluts und so weiter. And this text is the second chapter of his collected work cited by Kempter, and it was published in 1705. The second important author whom Bonelli sought to refute in detail was Jacques Basnage, Calvinist theologian and thinker born in Rouen, emigrated to the Netherlands, who also spoke out against anti-Judaism in the spirit of tolerance in his monumental 6-volume history of the Jews. It was published in 1707. So it may now be clear, Bonelli and the members of the Accademia Taxiana and even Tartarotti were not at all at the stage where they could be persuaded or convinced by any reason to have the slightest doubt about ecclesiastical practice or established religious cult. To be sure, this was never their intention, since the quote from the statutes of the Accademia Taxiana, that was the seventh point, sacra fidei dogmata intacta manento. So there was no place to discuss the dogmata and arcana status and questiones scholasticas. But there was no need for this anyway. The endorsement came from the highest place. Pope Benedict XIV, in his bull of 22 of February 1755, confirmed the cult of Simonino and beatified Andreas. Andreas was not canonized as a saint because he was unaware of his martyrdom. So that was the official explanation. But anyhow, the cult based on blood label has been reinforced in the Catholic religious life in Trentino and Tyrol, and thanks to the dissemination of the tales of the Grimm brothers and other forms of religious propaganda, became part of the popular culture in general in Germany. In Tyrol and Trentino, where Jews had been unknown for centuries, this didn't cause social problems for a certain time. In Eastern Europe, however, especially in Poland, pogroms and anti-Semitic murders based on blood label accusations were already gaining momentum in the mid-18th century. In 1758, the Jewish community in Poland sent a man named Jakob Zelig to Rome to complain at the Curia about the deplorable conditions and to persuade the Catholic Church to take a stand regarding the blood label. The future Pope, Clement XIV, he was also the dissolver of the Jesuit order, Lorenzo Ganganelli, wrote his famous memorandum at this time, in which he reviewed in detail the various cases of blood labels in history and proved that most of them were based on false accusations, with two exceptions. He acknowledged the murders of Andreas and Simonino, committed by the Jews, having been just confirmed by the current Pope, although, as we have seen, the murder of Andreas was itself highly questionable. However, he also denied by a peculiar argument that the Jews were motivated by the ritual use of blood. At this point, however, he could only obscure the problem. The rather blurring term odium fidei Christianorum became the motivation for the murder of both Andreas and Simonino, behind which, thanks also to the recent work of Bonelli and Kempter, all decent Catholics continued to think what they wanted. The cult of Andreas and Simonino persisted for a long time since then, and the idea of blood label naturally also played a significant role in maintaining modern prejudice and hostility towards the Jews, the consequences of which are known to all. So, reaching the conclusion and citing a famous paragraph from Immanuel Kant, if it is now asked whether we at present live in an enlightened age, the answer is no. But we do live in an age of enlightenment. As things are at present, we still have a long way to go before men as a whole can be in a position, or can even be put into a position, of using their own understanding confidently and well in religious matters, without outside guidance. So this sentence by Kant provide, I think, an excellent counterpoint to what we have seen above in the case of Andreas, beatified in 1755, and illustrate the existence of a Zatte, so the Kosselakian sense, Zatterzeit, between the pre-modern and the modern age, in which elements of the old and the new culture were still in organic coexistence. Academic networking, information exchange, scientific data collection, and source criticism were criteria that the members of the Innsbruck Academy were seemingly able to meet. This compatibility, however, did not affect their fundamental and unquestionable Catholicism, and did not at all imply that they felt any need to give up their cultural prejudices and indoctrination in exchange for an objective examination of the facts. On the contrary, they saw the study of history solely as a means of reinforcing existing cultural institutions and even local identities against cosmopolitan or universal influences and trends, what they clearly considered harmful. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gábor, for this really truly fascinating lecture, which combined, to my opinion, the almost micro historical perspective dealing with this local cult of saints of Simonino and Andreas, based on all these anti-Jewish accusations and prejudices, and going to the end of your lecture to generalizations regarding Aufklärung, regarding the Enlightenment and its more general cultural, let's say, context. So thank you once again, and I would like to open the discussion. Your comments, questions, remarks. Floor is yours.
Sorry, my basic provocative question was actually just emerging through this journey, that can we call at all the Catholic Enlightenment, or can we label the Catholic Enlightenment as enlightenment?
Yes.
Just to give you a hint.
Okay. Yes, Johanna?
Yes, thank you very much, Gábor. Very, very interesting story. Maybe I didn't really understand it correctly, but I was asking myself, at the time between Guarinoni and Roschmann, was there a cult like by the common people also, or was this an erudite discussion, or was it just a Stiftbilden and other, you know, more important and erudite Catholic figures behind this cult? Was there something? Because Guarinoni was a very important figure, but I can't imagine a foreigner, he was not a Tyrolean, coming to Hull and telling common people what to believe. You know, it's just so strange to me, because, I mean, either, as you said, I imagine there must have been some oral history behind it, or the anti-Semitism was just so big that they were just so ready to accept it. What do you think?
The picture is contains all of these elements, I think. So it was, we don't know how vivid was the cult of Andreas, or a boy who was murdered previously by the Jews at the time of Guarinoni. But he collected some stories, and he was the inventor in that sense, that he basically fixed every single element of the story. And then it played also a part in this, the strong anti-Semitism also in the 17th century. I mean, there is some Jacobus Bade, for example, he wrote also a quite famous poem against the Jews, and he also citing the Andreas case. So, and after Guarinoni, it seemed to be that it was also a popular already cult around Andreas, because exactly what Guarinoni has achieved. So in his last will, he really gave money to establish this church at the Judenstein, and the church was made, and it was built up, and everything was set up for the later developments. And what Roschmann and the Academia Taxiana and the members of the Taxiana achieved, that was also just the so to say, the coronation of all of these developments, just in the doorstep of Enlightenment absolutism, which is quite funny and paradoxical, but that was the case. Thanks, anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hmm. You mentioned also, Gabor, this whole body of the dissertations from Academia Taxiana,
Yeah.
and these two were related to blood libel and
Yeah.
anti-Semitic topics. Were there other dissertations related to the topic of the Jews or to the topic of Islam, for example, or
No,
to other stereotypes related to other religious groups?
no. What I mean, the topic leading to this anti-Semitism, for the leading topic for Roshman was the church history and the local church history and the history of local saints. So for Roshman, Andreas and Ursula were just new local saints, and this because he was so patriotic Tyrolean, so he
Yes,
just
I understand. You mentioned that the dissertations had very strong local aspect, but
yes.
at the same time, they were directed towards general history, if I understood well.
Not general history, but to history in general,
Okay,
so
okay,
to say.
sorry.
But they were discussing also in some biblical questions. For example, what was before the Great Flood,
Uh-huh.
and then other things, or the origins of languages, or the origins of the mm, erudite literature or culture, so to say.
Hmm.
But yeah, the main aspect, especially well, in the second half of this of the activity of the Taxiana, was or laid on the local history.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, Roshman wrote several dissertations on the history of uh, noble families.
Okay. So there was no like response, for example, to Hebraic studies of the period or
No. That was the only case, I have to say.
okay.
So they were really closed and really conservative
Hmm.
Catholics, I think.
Okay, thank you. So, any other questions or comments? Yes, Johanna, once again.
Yeah, if I may again. Um, are the dissertations just the dissertations that we have or that we know of, are they just from the members? Because you mentioned that they also have had guests speaking, or do we have something written also from the guests? Or can you see some, if we have information about what the guests spoke about, are they also conservative, or is there a bit more of a positive enlightenment, or no, just to
No. Only distinguished guests were allowed. Yeah, and unfortunately, the entire corpus is hasn't survived. So this because according the but yeah, fortunately or luckily, we have the protocols, all the protocols and minutes, actually in two exemplars. So there is an original one, and so it was made in on the spot, and we have also a copy, but it's a part copy, but almost entirely contains the protocols, and then these are the most excellent material, I think, and for this for these manuscripts, I think worth to studying the Academia Taxiana. But yeah, and for Roschmann, because he was the leading figure, it's quite clear that his main purpose was establish a local academy of the local history. That's for sure. Never succeeded.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. You also mentioned, Gábor, and showed us some examples of the correspondence between Kempter and Tartarotti, if I remember well. So, can you tell us more about the correspondence of figures like Roschmann and Kempter, and to what extent was the local academy perhaps a part of the broader network, communication network within the Habsburg lands or within the broader region of Central Europe? Is it possible to reconstruct this from correspondence?
In some extent, yes. We have letters in the Tartarotti library. It's called the Rovereto Biblioteca di Comune Tartarotti library, and they have all the letters to and from Tartarotti, actually. Well, Roschmann had the most extensive correspondence, of course. He was publishing also because he really, so not his entire oeuvre remained in manuscripts. He published some ecclesiastical historian works on local saints, and he published his famous Val di Dena. So Val di Dena was the Roman settlement here in Innsbruck. But probably the most important figure was Cardinal Quirini, who was also in correspondence, for example, in the Brno Academy. This was the Academia, probably you know this. And Quirini was a travel agent of the papal diplomacy, basically. So he connected in his person these Catholic or Habsburg land academies, I think. And we have also some letters, for example, on how Quirini tried to get some critical acceptance in Italy, in Florence, also among the Catholic circles of certain of Roschmann's works. So it's quite interesting how they tried to, I don't know, play science in that time in these circles. So yeah, the most extensive correspondence we have from Roschmann, actually, but it still has to be collected.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Yes.
Yes, Karin, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question, and sorry if it's, but I would like to know if there is other cases, examples of in the Holy Roman Empire in that period of similar construction of history on prejudices and anti-Semitism examples. So it's my questions.
Mm-hmm. As far as I know, no. So this was the most probably peculiar and the latest example in the West. So yeah, probably you have seen this Der Stürmer front page. So this was the front page of the issue of Der Stürmer, in which they collected all the examples of the blood label accusations. They accepted it as true, of course, the Nazis. But no, I mean, there were other cases, but mostly from Poland, for example, or from Hungary. From the 19th century, there is a very famous case. But yeah, from the West, this was the last but also the most successful one, because they were accepted as well, they were officially canonized by the Catholic Church. So it's a link between the medieval and the modern anti-Semitism, so to say.
Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Yes, sure. Go ahead, Gábor.
I'm just too ignorant about the history of anti-Semitism, but have you read something about the reaction of Enlightenment philosophers to anti-Semitism, or is it becoming a topic during
It became a topic, yeah. Mostly, I mean, yeah, Mendelssohn is the most famous. So the Enlightenment Jews who tried to find a way of life in the German Empire, or in Prussia especially. So the Mendelssohn family and Moses Mendelssohn was the most famous, and yeah, there are plenty of, almost a library, of course, on this question. Yeah, quite recent publications as well. Yeah, that was, so I mean, this Tyrolean case, and then especially this beatification process, was probably a blind spot of the scholarship, but all other things are quite clear.
How famous did it become in front of Mendelssohn or other enlightened scholars?
Once again, sorry, what was the
How
question?
famous this Tyrolean case became in front of enlightened philosophers? Did they know about it? Did they use it as an example of superstitious religious attitudes, or did it have any echo?
I don't know anything, but my perception probably is that these were entirely separated words. So the separation started at this time already, and well, from the Catholic side as well, of course, because they were enclosing themselves with using these absurd theories from the other people. So when it became an issue, it was so issue of mutual communication and fervent discussion. It was only in the 19th century, through the modern anti-Semitism. But yeah, Mendelssohn and the others, I think they wanted just to ignore it.
Okay, thank you. Any other question or comment? I have one more, if I may. Sorry for that. I'm just curious about, the publication practice or publication strategy within the Academia Taxiana, whether these dissertations were just, local local thing, or whether they were broadly distributed in the Habsburg monarchy, and what was the number of copies in which they were published, etc.?
Well, the entire corpus remained in manuscript, first of all. We don't know how many copies were in circulation before or after the reading sessions. So there is only one.
So nothing was printed at all.
Nothing was printed at all, because
okay.
I mean, with the exception of Roschmann's works, but in Roschmann's case, these were more like a preparation or just a part of the topic to be published in a later, more elaborate and more long work, treatise or anything like that. So the texts themselves have been never published. Actually, we have only part of the entire corpus, and but exactly from this letter kept in the Vienna archives. So this long letter from Roschmann from the end of the 40s. He also mentions this corpus, and he wanted to publish them. So he wanted basically, well, a big amount of money, of course, for himself, but the activity of this imagined local Academy of History would have included also the publication activity. So I think that was his purpose, that he wanted to publish these already available material on the local history.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he never got the permission, and then he never got.
So if I understand well, apart of the dissertations, there were no other publications by the Academia in these 15 years of.
No. There were no publication at all.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Stefano.
Just sorry, it's a memory of reading more than anything else. But in a recent volume for Brill, which was about the early modern disputations, where you had all of these case studies from basically all over Europe, like from Sweden, the German-speaking world, and so on. You know the one. There is also mention of the Academia Taxiana and the context there strikes me as very global. I mean, the idea is that it's not a local phenomenon at all. It's actually a sort of orchestration between an old relic, scholastic sort of mentality of doing things, and then something very new. And you mentioned in your talk the Jesuits, which of course were suppressed in 1973. So the question is more or less, well, I guess the general question is, how local is this story really, and how global? And then within this larger sort of phenomenon, is there any source that tells us how the theological faculties were reacting to the suppression of the Jesuits, and if they have in their diaries or manuscript sources some sort of contention against the suppression, or some sort of tension that essentially we can see from these sources concerning this particular period? Because as you say, it's a subtle Zeit. Yes, it's a subtle time, but it's also the time where the Jesuits disappear. And so in a place like Innsbruck, where the Jesuits were so powerful since the Mandruzzo, and I mean all of this incredible period of the 16th century sort of bishop king, well, I mean the whole world seems to become to an end, so yeah. What do we make of that? Sorry.
Well, that was probably the most so to say enlightened element in this story. So the anti-Jesuitism, that was the common ground for the different actors in this, well, drama, so to say. But I think for different reasons. So Roschmann's reasons were also different. The Wilton Monastery, which is a Benedictine monastery, was also different because so they were rivalizing, of course, with the Jesuits. And the suppression of the Jesuits, well, if Roschmann had lived that, then he would have been happy, of course, but he didn't live so long. So because he died in 1760. So yeah, and regarding the global or modern or anything like that, it was global in a Catholic sense, I think. So because they had really they were corresponding with academics, but only with Catholic academics. It was really with really small exceptions. It remained a strictly Catholic business, and the target was nevertheless more or less just the Tyrol, the history of Tyrol, and not anymore. There were some interesting and more, so to say, erudite figures among the members, but at the beginnings, only at the beginnings, just like the famous Josef Rieger, who was professor of law at the University of Vienna later, or who was the Grazer. I don't remember his Christian name, but so, and yeah, he was also corresponding with Italians, but probably the failure was due the personality of Roschmann, because Roschmann's so strong, and he also has had a so strong influence on the academia. And yeah, his main interest, he never, I mean, the farthest he got was Lienz. Mm-hmm. So he never gone outside from Tyrol, actually. He was a quite, well, local and provincial. Yeah, and I know because, yeah, this study you are citing is, I think it's the one from Isabella. Mm-hmm. So the leader of our project, but probably she tried to, I don't know, to give to this some bigger context, as in reality it was.
Uh-huh. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So if there is no other question or comment, I would like to thank once again to Gábor for his talk today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we will meet next Monday. It's the 2nd of December. Stefano will be chairing that session, and there will be a talk by Oded Rabinovich on the topic Aristocratic Science and Book Publishing, the case of Blaise François, Comte de Pagan. So again, well, it's 17th century. We are back in the 17th century, and I'm very much looking forward to see you all next Monday. Thank you.